Um, hey, this is John. Today, I just wanted to address a couple things inspired by recent news, which is something I don't typically comment on. Obviously, though, an understanding of economics does require politics and vice versa, so I do see a lot of news, and I will be commenting on some of it today. A lot of the news is very frustrating these days, and I'm sure it's that way. Regardless of the political beliefs that you hold or did hold, and if it's not frustrating yet, then I'm like 90% sure that it will be frustrating the next 1 to 2 years. So, earlier in the week, I saw something pretty frustrating in the news. Then the most recent ICE shooting did occur as well afterwards, as I'm sure everyone is aware of by now. More generally, the last 14 months have been nothing but bad news, frankly, in the economic sphere. So I want to discuss two things this week. I should also say political sphere, but I will split this into two videos. So first, the video on shifting economics, which is going to be this one, and the second is on general discourse in politics and how I think that has really contributed to the current situation in the political landscape. So, politics affects economics and vice versa. Obviously, the neopolitical landscape is, given its dynamic nature, really hard to predict right now. Some of the more obvious predictions that I've made have come to fruition. So, for example, the strengthening of Chinese trade and its place in the global economy. And, recently Mark Carney has suggested that the current economic regime has come to an end, but I actually think that happened in December of 2024. And I think economists have been, experts generally have been pretty resistant to this idea that the historical precedents set by economics might not be such a great guide for the next little while, given that there is a massive shift in the political economic landscape occurring. And I do find this to be a pretty pernicious issue because I'm pretty sure myself and most people, including experts now, are basically just holding our breaths for the future at this point. And no one really seems to have a clear idea of what's going on anymore, and it's been that way for a while. Now, obviously, we can create case scenario outcomes and say, if this, then this, and do that multiple times. But, there isn't much of a guiding compass over the next 3 years. At least it seems that way to me. But if you had asked me, say, 16 months ago, which direction the economy was moving, in, say, the next 3 to 12 months, then I'd have a very clear picture of, which direction it was moving. And I guess, with that said, I do have a pretty clear picture of which direction it's moving in. It's just hard to know how bad is it going to be. And also, obviously, this has been the result of the new US regime being extremely stochastic in its behaviors, with almost all of those actions being economically relevant. So, the current US regime, from an economic standpoint, has been obviously behaving in a rather ridiculous fashion, with a lot of their proposals going against the grain without any feasible basis, and some policies adopted from the era preceding the Great Depression, which was a heavy critique that I had going into the 2025 regime. And you might wonder, okay, well, why would a bunch of rich people want to crash the economy? And this is a great question with a surprisingly simple answer. It's that assets get cheaper, then they buy them. And then when the prices go up, they get much wealthier. This is a well-known effect, and we can use an indicator like the Gini coefficient, which measures wealth inequality, to understand this. And basically, in every single market downturn in the US history, the Gini coefficient has moved up significantly, which indicates increased wealth concentration. Upward, obviously. Aside from the possibility that the administration really is being deliberately obtuse, Another concern is that the economic effects and the global response to Trump's behavior is probably not going to subside after his term is over. And maybe they can smooth things over with trade relations if their government puts new measures in place to interfere with this sort of nonsense happening in the future. But I don't really see how they're going to convince global trading partners to not migrate their trade away from the U.S. as a primarily consumer market over the next 10 to 20 years, given that no one can really trust them or their agreements. Take, say, their actions against Kuzma, for example. So, and I guess I should say Trump's actions against Kuzma. Okay, so aside from that, I do think that the unemployment and underemployment situation in North America is probably going to get worse over the next 1 to 2 years, unfortunately. And part of this is also that I'm starting to seriously speculate that unemployment may be manufactured for the benefit of business. And I mean that literally, like manufactured. So, for example, I should probably caveat this by saying that, no one can really know something like this for sure. And so this will remain a conjecture basically forever unless I somehow gather, overwhelming evidence for it. But, anyways, for example, it's very weird to think that the unemployment rate is approximately the same across all fields, almost all of them being between 7 and 8%, whether it's physics or art. And maybe you could try to argue that this is economic diversification, but my problem with that is that economics for a country would best focus on comparative advantages, and businesses naturally do this anyways to maintain their competitive edge in the market. So we should see some kind of outlier, I would think. And then maybe another example is that the conversations generally surrounding entry employment have been shifting over time from say useless degrees to skills-based economies to experience. And even if we disagreed on the basis of there being useless degrees in the first place, the most recent set of reasons are perhaps surprisingly unjustifiable, where pretty much every bit of research out there, there's some disagreement, but in science and generally everything, you'd go with the consensus of experts. So the research seems to concur that, very surprisingly, there's a very weak correlation between ability and experience. So obviously by themselves these don't say much, but the narrative is really easy to spin and makes so much sense. By imposing job scarcity, large businesses would get a better selection of candidates, and current employees would be more docile with the threat of losing their jobs, and most importantly, our rights at the workplace could be stripped and our wages driven down. So again, obviously you can't really get to the bottom of these issues as an outside observer, but that's one of the things that's been occupying my head more recently, I suppose. Now, obviously, to most people, politicians as spokespersons for their parties do effectively sweep these issues under the rug and pretend that these systems work well, and that for example, that you can find a job. So if you take Doug Ford's recent comments about McDonald's, and if you look for a job, I guarantee you'll find one, are funny to consider in light of the unemployment rate only consisting of people who don't have a job and are looking for one, meaning people are looking for jobs and cannot find one. Case closed. So one last bit of comments that I have to make on the grand economic scenario is that with a big grain of salt, and though I do seem to have a rather good track record of predicting crappy scenarios, and maybe it's just because I'm willing to contend with crazy ideas, in light of my earlier comments, I think it's now on the table that the S&P 500 may not continue moving with the same momentum as it always has, and that's actually something I thought back in early 2025 as well. And there's lots of reasons for this. For example, the lasting effects of trade that I mentioned earlier, right? But I think also, in a very weird way, this is something that big firms really are ignoring. And I say that because I feel the conversations around that are ill construed at best. So, for example, the suggestion by professional firms has been that the price to earnings on the S&P 500 is historically high, but if we remove the top 10 stocks, for example, then it becomes normal. But the S&P 500 is cap weighted, so those 10 stocks are a little over 38% of the index right now. So I don't really think that makes any sense. In other words, they're saying, well, if you just take out a huge chunk of the index, it's all gravy. Okay. Now, additionally, there does seem to be a huge disconnect between the VIX index and the political uncertainty index, which I think is very relevant in this case. And, additionally, about a year ago, I did run a private study with a proprietary regression model on the S&P 500. And I just say regression model for example. There are other models that I've looked at, but anyways, looking at the economic correlates with the S&P 500 and indicators, and found that the only reliable and sensibly so indicator was tech stocks, which may or may not be on the fritz right now. Anyways, I think going forward in a socially sustainable society does require new economic theory lending itself to policy changes, and that would help provide an answer to a lot of the problems that are currently poised in the market. And I'm hoping to work on creating that system myself, actually, and it'd be cool to do that, but that's very complicated, and it's possible I will find that I don't have a single unique idea to contribute. So at the very least, I'll probably be trying to attempt a really serious critique of the political economy in the next couple of years, and I'm hoping that it stands the test of time. So anyways, this is the end of the first video this week, and if you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe, and I do hope you watch the other one on unhealthy political discourse.